From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Larry Appelbaum from the Music Division here at the Library of Congress. It is our great pleasure to be participating in this citywide celebration of Blue Note at 75. Now, we initially conceived today as a film screening because we have a very rarely shown documentary film on Blue Note in our collection. But when I found out that we could convene a panel like this, I said later for the film. We can do that anytime. What I think is most important is to remember that as much jazz as you might find in a university classroom, so much of this music is still an oral tradition. It's passed on by those who have the knowledge and direct experience, and it's passed on from person to person or from person to group. So what I'd like to do is take a moment to introduce our panelists. We will have a conversation about Blue Note, about the legacy, the music, etc. We'll open it up for questions. And then Dan Ellett is here. He's actually sitting in the back there. He's written a new biography with Bruce Lundvall. He will be signing that book. And so we hope you'll stick around. Immediately following this discussion, we will have the book signing. I think you purchase the book there, and then Dan will be in the back, in the foyer of the Coolidge Auditorium signing your books. Okay? So let's get started. I hope that everybody in this room knows Lou Donaldson. You certainly should. Wonderful alto saxophonist and band leader. He's basically performed in every style and era of jazz. Everybody knows he's a follower of Charlie Parker, but he's done so much more than that. Blues and ballads and bebop and hard bop and soul jazz and crossover jazz. He's done all of that and more. He was a 2013 National Endowment for the Arts Jazz Master, and he is still out there on the trail at the age of 87, showing all the youngins how it's done. Please help me welcome Lou Donaldson. Sitting next to Lou is a jazz record producer, writer, and label owner, Michael Cuscuna. Like many people in the business, he started out on radio. He worked at various labels, ESP Disc, Motown, ABC, where he worked on a lot of impulse reissues. He also worked at Arista and Muse, Freedom, Elektra, and Novus. But he's probably best known for his work reissuing. In fact, there's probably nobody in the world who knows more about what's in the vaults of Blue Note and other labels than Michael Cuscuna. I like to think of him not just as a producer, but as a kind of jazz detective. I want you to help me welcome Michael Cuscuna. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention about Michael that he's a 3-time Grammy Award winner, and he's also co-founder and owner of Mosaic Records, the premier reissue box set label. So again, Michael, thank you for coming. Anybody who's been paying attention to jazz for the last 15 years will know Jason Moran, not just as a fine pianist and band leader, but as an educator. He's been teaching at NEC, New England Conservatory, sorry, and as well as at the Manhattan School of Music. He is a multiple award winner, probably most notably for his MacArthur Fellowship. Excuse me. Here in Washington, we know him best as the artistic advisor for jazz for the Kennedy Center, and I was so pleased to see that he's re-signed and re-upped for another 3 years. Please help me welcome Jason Moran.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start more or less at the beginning. I'm very curious about the two men who co-founded Blue Note Records, Alfred Lion and Francis Wolff. And of everybody here, I think, Lou, you probably have had the closest relationship with the two. How well did you know them? How did you first meet them? And tell us a little bit about Alfred Lion and Francis Wolff.
Well, actually, I met Alfred at Minton's Playhouse. I was performing there, and he came by with his right-hand man, as we call him, Ike Quebec, who was around to keep him from making bad mistakes. And he asked me, he listened to what I played, and he liked it. He said, "You want to make a record for Blue Note?" I said, "Of course." And he said, "Can you play like Charlie Parker?" I said, "Of course." Of course I couldn't. But I didn't tell him that. But anyway, we got together, and he got me a date with Milt Jackson. Now, it was involved with that. It was a friend of mine named Art Woods, ex-prize fighter, who would come to hear me practice. I'd practice at a place at 116th Street and 8th Avenue in Harlem. And we paid a guy 50 cents for an hour, 50 cents an hour. But once he got 3 or 4 50 cents, you didn't see him anymore. He was running around doing other things. Actually, you know, being from North Carolina, I was kind of a country boy on the square. So he'd get himself $5 or $6, and he said, "Well, I'm going to get some smack, you know." Well, I didn't understand what he said. I thought he was saying he was going to get a snack. So one day I told him, I hit him in the stomach. I said, "Man, you better stop running around and eating those snacks. You gaining weight." And he used the N-word on me. He said, "Where you from?" He said, "You must be from the country." I didn't say no snack. I said smack. And then I realized I didn't know what smack was. But as we said, we got together with Art Woods, who knew Milt Jackson. Now, Art was a prize fighter, but he couldn't take a punch. Every time he'd fight, you know, somebody would knock him out. But he was a smooth boxer. He knew everything. So after I'd finished my rehearsal, he'd bring his gloves by, and we'd work out. Because just getting to Harlem, you know, I needed to know a little thing about self-defense. But I told him one day, I said, "Well, I don't need to know anything about self-defense. I got the best defense you can have." And what did he say? So I pointed to my feet. I said, "I'm a fast runner." But anyway, he got to Milt Jackson, and we recorded this tune, Bag's Groove. Of course, I know you've heard it. And it was the original modern jazz quartet. Although at that time it was Milt Jackson's quartet. Milt, John Lewis, Percy Heath, and Kenny Clark. And it came off pretty good. So Alfred said, "Well, I think you better make a date, you know, with the company." And I was reluctant to do that, you know, on my own. I said, "I don't know, Alfred." But so we tried this date. And I brought in Horace Silver, Gene Ramey, and people like that, Art Taylor and stuff like that. And we did this date, and it was pretty successful. And so I got real familiar with Alfred and Frank Wolff. Actually, I was more compatible with Frank than Alfred because Alfred was nervous. He was a very nervous fellow, and he did at that time, he didn't have any money, you know, because he had recorded a lot of Dixieland bands, and the only one he really loved was Monk. He loved Monk. Every time I'd go to his office, he'd have Monk and Nellie would be there, Monk's wife. And actually, the first time when I thought Monk was working there, I didn't know. What did I know? I'm from the sticks, so I didn't know anything. But but we all got to be very tight, and he knew, my family and all my kids and everything, so we got to be pretty good. Then he told me slightly a little bit about his getting out of Germany, but not the whole story, but I knew what was happening, so we got compatible, and that lasted for many years. And Alfred was a great person, no doubt about it, and Frank. But Alfred was really, he loved Monk, although at that time he couldn't sell the records. He made them, but it was hard to sell those records by Monk because people weren't really ready. Hell, they're not even ready for them now, but but back then they really weren't ready for them. He could sell them in New York, Chicago, and like Los Angeles and San Francisco, but like the intermediate towns like Atlanta, Kansas City, St. Louis, Birmingham, someplace like that, he had trouble selling them. But the distributors wouldn't take them because, they didn't really understand the music. But he got past that because we got to making a few records that sold, especially Blues Walk and The Masquerade Is Over, which got on the jukebox, and from coast to coast, from New York to California. And we became real good friends then. And enemies too, because I wanted to go up on my price. And Alfred would always say, well, I'll think about it. But he was thinking too long, So I said, well, Alfred, you keep on thinking. I'm not going to make any more records until you finish thinking.
Michael, let me ask you, who did what when we're talking about Alfred and Francis? Do you have a sense of?
Well, from what I gather, I knew Alfred. I talked to Frank a couple times on the phone, but I didn't really know him. I hadn't met him face to face. But essentially, people, when they work together, they tend to do what each of them does best. And Alfred was as Lou said, very high-strung guy, very nervous guy. But he was the guy that, planned the sessions, dealt with the artists, and produced the records. Frank was, at the sessions, was basically the chronicler, the photographer, and an astonishing archive. And at the office, I think I got the impression that Frank handled the books and the business part of it, and Alfred basically handled the creative part of it. Is that the impression you got, Lou?
That's about it.
Yeah.
So, in those early, we have certain mythologies about Blue Note Records. A lot of people, if you were to ask people in this audience, what does Blue Note represent to you? A lot of people might say it's that 1950s, 1960s hard-bop thing. But there was a lot of swing, boogie-woogie, and early jazz in the early years, starting in 1939. Jason, I wonder, what is it that initially drew you to the Blue Note sound? How much of that early Blue Note material are you familiar with?
Well, now it's a lot. Those, Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons, just as pianists, you kind of have to pay attention to how physical and how extremely, rhythmic all that is, and then them to play together. And also, as some of the first, I would say, interesting things I felt like I learned to get me to the point where I wanted to study jazz music was to play some boogie-woogie stuff, especially in the South. But then, also, there was a point where when I asked for something for Christmas, my older brother gave me 2 tapes, The Genius of Modern Music, Thelonious Monk Volumes 1 and 2, with Lou Donaldson on it. And so I heard those tapes, those records, and looked at this man, Thelonious Monk, and thought, okay, and this kind of cover, this red cover, and then this kind of tannish cover, and what kinds of records are these? I'm looking at a tape. And then at that point, it becomes very clear that also what was beautiful I thought about Monk was that he could show me what preceded him in his playing, but also what was going to come in his playing too, like the future of the music. And it was it was kind of captivating because I felt he encapsulated like the true essence of the music, especially from the piano's point of view. But recently, really like starting to really get into like understanding what boogie woogie piano is, and also like the divide that some pianists had about it after boogie woogie had stopped, like that it was, banging on the piano, like the people thought about it was kind of like discontent, as they would then think about bop, as then they would think about whoever else came afterwards. Like that part of the history also was really intriguing, and is intriguing, but I still love listening to that era because I thought those were the pianists that really set the mark so high for all of us to try to achieve, the pianists like Earl Hines and Fats Waller and Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Emmons.
I'm always curious how much of the output of Blue Note Records, especially under Lion and Wolf, how much of it reflected their personal taste versus what they think might sell in the marketplace?
I would venture to say most of it reflected their personal taste. The only group that I know that Alfred said he recorded just because he thought that they would sell records was the Three Sounds. And I think everything else was just what they loved,
Well, there was, again, a time in 1939 and through the 40s when he's recording a lot of swing era stuff, and then it becomes a much more modernist kind of outlook.
That was
Is there
Quebec.
Oh, that's at Quebec?
Quebec. They stopped recording for about a year when they were trying to figure out. And I think they kind of realized they were being outdated in their musical taste, and Ike was the one that introduced them to Monk, to Blakey, to all the bebop guys, and that's how that whole era began. It was and Ike was one of the leading swing musicians on Blue Note, so it was almost like he was working himself out of a job. But it was Ike that was the and of course that was a thing that I think that one of the secrets of Blue Note was that these guys were smart enough to shut up and listen to the musicians, and that's how they found people. Like, Lou brought an amazing amount of people to the label, and John Patton and Grant Green, Horace Silver,
Clifford Brown.
and Clifford Brown.
Never got paid
You never got paid?
for bringing them.
Oh, for bringing them, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the Three Sounds. I brought them to the label from right here. I was working 11th and U. They're right here in Washington, a place called Abots, and they worked up the street. And I went to hear them one night, and I called Alfred in New York. I said, Alfred, this group down here, you better come down and listen to, So he came down, listened to them play, and he said, oh, but we must bring them to New York. And we made the record, LD plus a 3.
Right.
And that was commercial. I mean, you say it's commercial, but
Well, Piano trios that was a big thing at that time.
Yeah, well, Alfred really didn't care about commercial, stuff.
Yeah.
He never did, but he loved Monk. He loved Monk. He was, probably enthused or amazed by what Monk was doing. So he loved Monk. That's why he stayed around there most of the time.
You were on a Monk session, his last Blue Note session, with one of the hardest tunes in Monk's canon to play, Skippy.
That was.
How much rehearsal time did you guys get?
We had one rehearsal.
That was it? Really?
One rehearsal, but what happened is he had Kenny Durham and Lucky Thompson, and they had been playing with him and had been playing that tune. So I was the odd man out. I was the guy that had to scuffle through. And see, Monk didn't write much stuff out. You had to learn it, So it was really tough. But I struggled through it. I got through it.
I'd love to know a little bit more about Ike Quebec and exactly what he did at the sessions. Clearly he advised the label owners about who to sign and what way to go, but what would he do when you walked into the studio? Was he an A&R person?
No, did nothing. He didn't have He didn't have anything to do with the sessions at all. He didn't even come to the sessions.
Lou was self-sufficient.
But he But he kept Alfred from making a mistake. If a guy couldn't play it, you know, he wouldn't recommend it.
Ike passed, I guess, in the early 60s. Was Duke Pearson the one who sort of played that role after?
No.
Oh, tell us.
No, I don't know anybody who played that role after Ike left. Nobody. Duke Pearson was a musician himself. Huh? Who? Oh, no.
So what exactly did?
None of those people had in there. Well, what happened is after I got my stuff to going with Blues Walk and Masquerade is Over, and he signed Jimmy Smith, and that was a new thing altogether for Blue Note. That put them in another category. Then they could compete with any kind of music, you know. Up until then, it was back and forth. But once Jimmy Smith got there, it was gone. He didn't have anybody else advising him on anything after that I knew of.
That was also the era when they transitioned from 10-inch to 12-inch.
Yeah, from that long playing, right. Something like that.
Yeah.
Almost put him out of business.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, the cost of retooling everything, of remastering all the music and making it into 2 20-minute programs instead of 2 12-minute programs, and all the cost of all the additional artwork and stuff. It was a time when Alfred almost sold the label. He almost sold the label to Atlantic for like $15,000, which he actually was happy he didn't, you know. But it was a rough time for independent labels, you know. And by the late 50s, as Lou said, Lou's records were selling and Jimmy Smith's records were selling, and you know, he got on a roll, and
Game Lee Morgan. You know,
yeah, and then by the
Herbie
60s,
Hancock.
big hits.
So he started making money.
Yeah. Of course, making money is a dangerous thing in the record business, and it's actually why Blue Note Records was sold to Liberty Records, because Alfred and Frank couldn't maintain enough cash to keep the business going. Because when you have a hit like The Sidewinder or a song for my father, distributors tend to want to get more hits out of you, and so they tend to not pay you for the records you ship them until you get another hit that forces them to pony up the cash. And they just couldn't keep the business going by themselves, and that's why they sold it.
So Lou, when you had a big hit with Alligator Boogaloo, for example, did you feel pressure to follow up with something similar?
Me?
Yeah.
No. No. That was after the company was sold when I had that hit.
Yeah.
With another company. Not even Liberty, another company. They had
United Artists.
Yeah, they transferred it to another company. And they had these, actually it's a very funny story. Alfred never really told me he sold the company, but I got a call one day to come to Fifth Avenue for Blue Note Records. And I said, well, somebody making a fucking mistake here. I said, Fifth Avenue? Blue Note is down at Bloomingdale's in the back of the thing. So I go to Fifth Avenue, and these big-time lawyers come in with these suits and ties and had all these papers there for you to read and everything. Said, Blue Note has been sold, so we're re-signing all of the artists. So I said, okay. So I sat down and started reading the contract. Well, you know, I just came out of college. I thought I was a smart fella, so I wasn't going to let anything get past me. So I looked on there, and I saw what they're going to pay me, artist royalties, performers, all royalties. I said, oh, man, this is a great contract. So I kept reading, and the boss kept coming in the room, said, are you finished? I said, no. And every time I'd run into something I didn't understand, I'd call one of the lawyers and say, what is this? And he'd read it out for me. And finally, when I finished, I got ready to leave, and he came by and said, I hate to tell you, Lucy, but you're the only one that read the contract. And I just made a joke out of it. I said, well, I'm the only one that can read it. But it was amazing because they brought in George Butler. I mean, the other people. I don't think Alfred hired him. You know, I think the other people hired him. Yeah. And he came in as an A&R man. So they had certain suggestions about tunes that I never listened to. You know, I never paid attention to them, you know, Because all the dates I made them the way I wanted to make them. I didn't really pay any attention to him because, he didn't know enough anyway to tell me what to play, so I didn't. And if I'd have listened to anything that he or any musician told me, I never made a quarter in this business, But what I did, I was on the road working, and I played the tunes for the people in the clubs. If they didn't get no applause, I didn't record them. If I saw what they liked, that's what I recorded. And that was it, right on the button.
Under Alfred Lyon and Francis Wolff, the label actually paid for rehearsals, yes?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes.
Did that change under when the label was sold?
Oh, yeah, it's much different.
What else changed when the label was sold?
Well, the whole world was changing, first of all. So many urban clubs were closing. There were far less booking agents. The whole infrastructure of jazz, the 24-hour commercial jazz stations in the major cities, it was all going away.
We're talking about mid-'60s now?
Late 60s, early 70s.
Okay.
Yeah. And the record business became more of a rock and roll business in the sense that people were getting bigger budgets and bigger promotion, and if you didn't sell X amount of copies, you were dropped. Gone were the days when, like, Lou or Horace Silver would be on a label for 25 years or 30 years. That was over. It became like a pop business. And I think it hurt jazz a lot. It hurt jazz a great deal in the 70s. He kept working, though.
Jason, you mentioned a kind of constant exploration of the label and its legacy. But I wonder, what did you hear when you first started listening to Blue Note? Which artists, which recordings?
It was Horace Silver, a song for my father. My father he's one of those guys. He wants to hear songs about him all the time. So he was like, can you learn Horace Silver? And, of course, anything to make you happy, Dad, And so Horace was really like that was one of the first solos I was really like learning, trying to figure out how he had that feel or play that bass line in the left hand, and then of course Monk, but also it was a big thing in the '80s that a lot of the samples in the '80s for hip hop were coming from all the Blue Note records, the drum sounds, yeah, so you would hear these organ sounds, you'd hear these drum sounds, you'd hear little snips of somebody's solo, from Blakey, everybody, and it was a way of like a rediscovery of it for my generation because you'd look on the back of these hip hop records and then say, okay, this has a sample of Alligator Boogaloo. Okay, what's Alligator Boogaloo? And then you go hear the actual song. There's now a website totally devoted to that called Who Sampled, and you can go, it's totally devoted to just finding a hip hop song and find out what the original sample is. And so that was also another way to really kind of get deep into the catalog, which my father had a great deal of it just in our house, and then trying to find records that I thought were a part of the tree or the chain that came from, Horace playing with Art Blakey or Monk playing with John Coltrane, and then just follow everybody around. Blakey with Lee Morgan, and that was a way to kind of just continually explore it because you could just follow the branches of the tree of each of these musicians and you'd see everybody else. And so you talk about the mythologies. The mythology that I grew up with was one that the label was a family, that you had musicians kind of constantly in each other's faces or being hired. That's a mythology, of course, but I love the feeling that you could look at all these records from Freddie Hubbard and Andrew Hill and Ron Carter, and Herbie and all these, Tony Williams, and they'd be in each other's pot, Wayne Shorter mixing it up, and Elvin and Sonny Rollins. And so you felt like you got a real scope of the history and the movement at the same time.
Lou, Jason mentioned sampling and people sort of making creative use of your work. Were you aware at the time that they were doing it, and did you get paid for that kind of borrowing?
I was not aware of it until I got paid. I started getting checks from Madonna, Mary J. Blige, people you would never expect. And Idris Muhammad, he got angry and called me because they were copying his drum beat. And I said, well, did you have it covered? You know, because you had to have it covered. You know, I said, if you didn't have it covered, I couldn't tell you. Well, he thought that I was getting the money from his drum beats, you know, which they were using the rhythm tracks. And but I said, well, Idris, you know, I can't give you any money. The check is in my name. I'm not changing the check. I said, plus you wouldn't even play that way if I hadn't made you play that way. But it was very profitable. It still is, even to the day, it's still profitable. Mm-hmm. But let me tell Jason something. He's a young guy. You're talking about me, Lux, Lewis, and Albert Ammons. Now, those guys played in the era where you had to have stamina to play a piano. It's not like today when they run across the piano like a chicken with his head cut off. Those guys had to create their own rhythm. Because a lot of times they didn't even have a drum or anything. They just played piano. And they'd have these boogie woogie contests. Now, boogie woogie contest is not just playing boogie woogie. It's how long you can play. And they say sometimes the guys would play 1 or 2 days still playing boogie woogie. People would come by and give them a drink and give them a sandwich they'd be eating. But the left hand would still be going. And the last one still standing would win the contest.
We're going to do that next season at the Kennedy Center. We're going to do that. Boogie Woogie contest.
Not nobody today can play that way. And one piano player, you're forgetting right in between all of these guys, although he didn't record for Blue Note. I don't think he did. Well, Michael can tell me if he did, because I didn't know everybody that recorded for Blue Note. But it's Nat Cole, right in between, like Hines and Fats Waller and all of them, and Art Tatum. Nat Cole came in and kind of purified everything and got leading up to the style of Bud Powell and those. But Nat Cole, a lot of people don't know that, but I know it because I'm old enough to know it, you know.
Tell us who were the Mizell brothers, because we're talking about this transition era before the revival.
They were, one or both of them were Donald Byrd's students, and they were studying privately with Donald, and they were both staff people at Motown Records, staff arrangers and songwriters, the R&B stuff. So, and you know, so Donald got the idea to do a record with them, and you know, I remember when Blackbird came out, I hated it, I despised it. I've since come to love the record because I was listening to it, I said, that's not jazz. And it's not jazz, but if you listen to it as great commercial R&B, it is very well done, you know. And of course, it created a whole era unto itself.
So they mined that era. They produced some big selling records for the label at that time.
One?
No, all of Donald's records sold like $5.
Actually,
and the Bobby Humphrey
record. What happened is, you know, I don't want to give you the information because you can write it up and make a lot of money. But they wanted Lee Morgan to record the record, and Lee wouldn't do it. And so then Donald got it. But actually, they wanted Lee Morgan to record that because the Mizell brothers were producers. Yeah. They were producers, right?
They made a lot of pop hits, too.
And they were smart guys, you know. They saw the change at the right time.
Right.
Like Blue Note saw the change at the right time. Because you know, once I started making all these records like Funky Mama and everything for they call it soul music, but it's really not soul music. All music got soul. You know, it's either bad or good, you know. That was good. The other stuff is bad soul. But anyway, they saw the change coming, and Creed Taylor saw it and made him a whole company, CTI. And you see, he used the same pattern that Blue Note was using at the end of, you know, at mid-50s. But he got that same pattern and got Stanley and Grover Washington. All those kind of people made him $1 million just by catching that at the right turn, like he said, when the music was changing. He caught it right at change and made a profit. Good money.
The secret weapon was Rudy Van Gelder, too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Rudy the Sound, of course, and no doubt about it.
I also want to ask you about the design of these records. For example, Lou, the music that you make is always compelling, but then I look at the album covers on some of your records.
Yeah.
Incredible. Really
That's Frank and what's the other
eye-catching.
guy? What's that?
Reed Miles?
Yeah, Reed Miles. Oh, they did that. They did that.
But I'm talking about even the stuff in the 70s, when you're not on the cover, but they would have a model on
Yeah,
the
I
cover.
know.
You know what I'm talking
I got
about?
a couple of those models myself to get on the company.
Uh-huh.
In fact, the one on
Good gracious.
Good Gracious. Now,
That's the one.
That was my wife's hairdresser. I got a broke rib here right now where she hit me with her elbow. Because every time she'd walk across the shop, I'd be looking. But that's what it was. In fact, I met her 2 years ago, and it was amazing. She's still alive.
Would you come up with the titles, like, of all your records?
Some of them, most of them I did, yeah.
Let's jump ahead just a little bit, and I'd like to know what circumstances led to Bruce Lundvall being in a position to help bring the label back to its glory. Michael, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I mean, in the ownership sweepstakes of everything, United Artists in the 70s was owned by Transamerica, which was a financial company and a car rental company and various other things. And they wanted to get out of the film and music business. And so there were two guys, Artie Mogul and Jerry Rubenstein, who did a leveraged buyout. And they got financing from EMI. And I think all along EMI knew that they were going to default. But EMI, Capitol Records was too big to buy another label. So by default, they automatically got all the holdings. So Blue Note and Pacific Jazz and Liberty and United Artists, all these labels moved over to EMI. And at that time, I made a proposal to reactivate Blue Note, because Horace had turned in his last record. The records I was putting out had come to an end, and the label was dead, completely dead for the first time. This was 1982. And they told me, we're rebuilding the label genre by genre. We're working on country now, and we're going to do rock, and we won't be ready for jazz for another 2 years or so. So I said, okay. And in the meantime, I had the idea for Mosaic, and so I started Mosaic, and that was that. And sure enough, like clockwork, 2 years later, Bruce Lundvall calls me and says, I've just been offered a job to come over to EMI he was at Elektra musician at the time, and very unhappy with the people he had to work with there. So he was right to make a jump. And so he said, they want me to do a New York-based pop label. And I said, as part of the gig, I want to revitalize Blue Note, And he said, I want you to be with me and do it with me. And so I said, fine, And so that's how that all happened.
He was signing new artists, and you were working on reissues, or were you working with him?
We were all doing everything. It's nice when it's a small operation. I was never hired by Bruce, and I was never given a list of things to do. When it's a small thing, you just do whatever's needed at the time. So, I mean, Monday I might be producing a record, and Tuesday I might be writing a magazine ad, and Wednesday I'd be doing reissues. It would just, whatever was needed. It was very unstructured in a good sense.
Most of us, I'm sure, are curious about, but not as knowledgeable about how reissues work and how well labels take care of their assets, let's just say. Why don't you just walk us through what you actually did to create these reissue series, what the challenges were and rewards?
Well, yeah, I mean, the biggest issue is how they treat their assets. And until the CD came along, companies didn't pay attention to their masters at all. I mean, to a frightening extent. Masters would be left behind in studios, and studios would go out of business and scrap masters. A lot of that kind of thing would happen. Alfred and Frank were very methodical. in a very Germanic, organized way about their masters, thank God. But the biggest thing in terms of reissues is what material to reissue. And for example, I would be like, I would, when I started to reissue, I knew I had tons of Art Blakey, tons of Lou Donaldson, tons of Jimmy Smith records. So those I could do at a very frequent pace. But like Sonny Rollins only made 5 records for Blue Note. So I knew I had to just parcel those out, one a year, one every 2 years. Because you want, the thing with the reissue series is you have to sort of keep the same sales level going. So you've got to parcel out your winners in kind of creative ways. And you know, the other thing is, with non-Blue Note labels, I mean, the source material becomes a very labor-intensive problem. And often you've got to needle drop from Virgin Records. Sometimes you'll find a master, and it's a master made in the 70s when they added so many highs and so much reverb, after the fact reverb, that the record is unlistenable. And so you'd have to go back to like a 60s pressing, or if you were lucky to find a un-EQ'd tape, you could do that. So there was a lot of sonic issues, but I mean, basically it's a strategic thing. You know, you have to know what you got and parcel it out in a sensible way.
Can you give us a sense of what some of the best-selling titles are in the Blue Note catalog?
Probably everybody in this room knows that. You know, Alligator, Boogaloo, the Sidewinder. Song for My Father. Look, how much in the first year or so? How much did Alligator Boogaloo sell?
I don't know, but it stayed on the chart for 52 weeks.
Yeah.
And it wasn't on the jazz chart either, the regular chart.
Mm-hmm.
I know it because I used to have competition with Eddie Harris. And
Oh yeah.
And it's listen here, listen.
Right.
You know, it stayed on there that long too. Yeah. And we'd meet each other and buy a Billboard magazine and start to talk. Well, my record's better than yours. Yeah, but it was nice, very nice.
Yeah.
So speaking of the Bruce Lundvall era, was it Bruce who signed you, Jason?
Yeah, it sounds like a story like kind of like Lou's, where I was playing. Actually, Lou came. I was playing with this band with Greg Osby, and Lou used to come see us every once in a while. He said, "This band needs to disband." Anyway, he probably don't remember that. But anyway, we were playing that. I remember it very well. But we were playing that Sweet Basil, and I'd been in Greg's band for maybe a year or so. We had made a record because Greg was signed to Blue Note, and Bruce, you know, came to the show and walked up to me as I was walking off the stage and said, "Let's make a record," you know. And I was 22, and I was like, I just graduated school. I was kind of out here working a little bit and eager, and so I've been with him for 16 years now. But Bruce, literally, and I felt like he was the reason that I could stay there, because I wasn't selling any records, but I was allowed to, much in the same way, just to go into the studio with whatever vision I had and make these records, you know, unadulterated, however I wanted. And so it's the relationship that I still have to this day.
What Bruce did was, and I think more instinctively than any other way, because he came from a big label culture. He was president of Columbia Records, which is the largest company in the world. But instinctively, what he did with Blue Note is he kept it like a little independent label, kept it separate from the mainstream of EMI. And that gave him a lot more autonomy and a lot more freedom and a lot more ability to try and keep some kind of spirit to the label.
But somehow he must have generated enough success, enough sales, that they left him alone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the first 2 years, reissues kept the label alive to an amazing degree. You know, and then once people started to sell, Stanley Jordan got a gold record, and Diane Reeves sold, and you know, I mean, basically, a lot of the success came from guitarists and singers, because there are more guitars in this country, and because singers sing words, you know. So, but there was always enough success to keep going.
In just a moment, I'm going to open it up for questions, so start to think about that for now. But where is Dan? I know Dan's out here in the audience. Dan, could I get you to come up here for just a second? Because I want to ask you a question, and I'll hand you a microphone. Dan has worked on this biography with Bruce Lundvall, and I want you to talk a little bit about what you've learned through this process, what the surprises are for you as a researcher and writer. I'm sure you knew Bruce before, but what did you learn from the process of
Yeah,
writing
I
the
did
book?
know Bruce, but I had no idea the streets it was going to go down and stuff. And he told me like a ton of stories. Most of them were factually correct. Some of them weren't. But one of the things that most impressed me about Bruce was that he loved the art. The music was to him art. And he wanted to promote artists. I mean, this goes all the way back to getting Herbie Hancock on Columbia. He told Clive Davis, you need to get him on Columbia. And Clive was even though in Clive's autobiography he says that, I had my eye on Herbie Hancock, but it was really, if you talk with Herbie, Herbie says that Bruce ushered me in. And then when he was still at Columbia, he got Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson was basically exiled from Nashville and went down to Texas. And at the time, Willie's manager was the same manager as Miles Davis. And he signed Willie Nelson and said, do what you want. And Willie Nelson put out this album or sent the demo, and it sounded like, a lot of people said it sounded like it was done in his kitchen. It was all stripped down. It didn't have the Contrapolitan strings and background vocals and everything. And Bruce listened to it at first and kind of went, wow, is this complete? And yes, it was complete. And so he sat on it and listened to it over a weekend and then went, oh, I get it. And then he sent his marketing team out into the mix and said, listen, this is Willie's, a special project by Willie. I really love it. Maybe it'll sell 30,000 copies, but I want you to really put a marketing muscle behind it. And it was Red-Headed Stranger, and it sold 3 to 4 million copies. So it was just Bruce's belief in Willie producing an album and to just let him go. So, I mean, even with Jason, he never said, okay, Jason, this is what I want you to do next, right? Never. Most of the artists, they would come in and they would say, I was even talking with Robert Glasper the other day, and when he got signed, he went into the office and was talking with Bruce, and he asked Bruce, what should I do? And he goes, well, you're the artist. You figure out what you want to do and do it, and I'll sell the records. And so that was the thing that was really important to me with Bruce, was he believed in the art, and he believed in the artist to let them find their way, to essentially evolve their music. And you look at a prime example right here. I mean, when Jason first started to where he is now, it's pretty remarkable to let an artist pursue their art. And having that kind of encouragement and nurturing, all that stuff.
I'm sure there are many more such stories in the book, and Dan will be signing copies of that book in just a few minutes. But now's, I think, an appropriate time to take any questions that you might have. Let's see a show of hands. Right there. If you'll stand up. And before you ask your question, I'm going to ask you your favorite Blue Note recording. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, my name is Paul Ford. I'm a D.C. native. First, my favorite recording is the 2-volume Thelonious Monk album, the one that has Around Midnight on it, and the several tracks of Ruby My Dear and Nice Work If You Can Get It. My father was a musician, and we had a huge jazz collection in our home. He subbed for Duke Ellington very early years until he started teaching in D.C. public schools. But I didn't really appreciate jazz until I moved to Berlin, Germany, and worked in this record store that sold all these old albums and new albums, and that's when I really got to know them, really fell in love with them. But I met a guy who was a South African musician, and he told me a story, and this is a question for Lou Donaldson, that actually around that time that Thelonious Monk made that album, that he actually was getting ready to quit the business, that he was very frustrated with his lack of creative freedoms. He was very frustrated with people stealing his work and very frustrated with just the business, and he almost quit. So I wanted to ask Donaldson what he knew about that era, what he knew about Thelonious Monk. And the second question is, what was it like, the sessions with him? Like if you started making mistakes, how would Thelonious Monk react to that? Because even today, when I look at, I was at the Kennedy Center a couple times, and when I listen to jazz concerts, something you mentioned, you have to play, you have to keep up, from the beginning to the end. And if somebody notices that you're not keeping up, it's like a real embarrassment. My father told me that this big saxophonist for, I don't know if it was Johnny Hodges or not, for Duke Ellington, he used to always get drunk. And if Duke Ellington saw he was drunk, what was his name? Yeah, and then Duke Ellington, if he saw he was drunk that day, he would make him play a solo, for a long solo. And they said he would play brilliantly, and as soon as it was over, he would just fall down in his chair and just collapse, because he would make him do that. So my questions were, Thelonious Monk, was he really ready to quit the business? How hard it was? How were the sessions with him? And whatever else you can comment on. Thank you very much.
Well, let me see. First place, Paul wasn't drunk. He was doing something else.
Having snacks.
Little vitamin C, double, triple C. But anyway, Monk was a weird guy. That's all I can tell you. He didn't talk much to anybody. Although every time I saw him, we had a good conversation. For some reason, he liked me, probably because I'm from North Carolina like he is. But at the sessions, I think we had one rehearsal. But Monk was reluctant about writing anything out. You had to memorize it, except that bad record that he talking about, Skippy. They had to write it out for me because I couldn't memorize. But anyway, it was easy working with Monk. You made mistakes here and there, but they straightened them out. And Monk himself was, Monk, a lot of people that write magazines, I call them the wrong people in the right places. Most of the writers, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because Monk was like a music genius. He was a genius. It was his music, it's the way he played it, and the way it sounded. It was his. Nobody else could do that, except, some spots Duke and Strayhorn did that way back, years ago. But Monk should be put in a category with Beethoven and Bach and Wagner and all those people. He was just a musician that had his music, and he played it his way. Now, he could take your music and play it his way, but it's hard for you to take his music and play it your way. But that's just what he was. And he was very sincere and very intelligent. We spoke a lot about politics and a lot of stuff. Monk was a guy that never talked out of the center of his mouth. He always talked out the corner of his mouth, like a fighter. Somebody, so you had to get real close to him to understand what he was saying. And I would tell you a joke, but I don't know.
No, go ahead.
It would take up all the time. They were in Yugoslavia one time, and Monk was over there, and the producer of the concert came by and said, Monk, I want to interview you. He said, you got a different style. Monk didn't say anything, just looked at him. And he asked him 2 or 3 more questions. Monk didn't say anything. So he went over to Monk's manager and said, listen, we paid you $20,000 to get Monk over here. So he got to say something, So the manager went back and said, Monk, look, I already got the money in my pocket. So you better say something to this guy. I don't want to have to give the money back. So Monk said, all right, I'll say something. So the manager came back and said, Monk, you were born in Wilson, North Carolina. And Monk said, something. He said, did you record for Blue Note? Something. And the manager came back, and Monk said, well, you told me to say something. That's what I said.
And
Who else has a question?
Well, if you're really interested, I just want to add one little thing. If you're really interested in Monk, I highly recommend Robin Kelly's book, his
Very much so.
biography.
Yes, sir.
We're asking favorite Blue Note recording?
Yeah.
Maybe Andrew Hill, Passing Ships. And this is kind of a two-part, or the same question for both of the gentlemen here. In rereading the liner notes, I'd forgotten that your dealings with Andrew apparently started in the late 60s. I know you produced records for him in the 70s. What were some of those first dealings with Andrew like when you first dealt with him for the first couple of years? Was he gigging and such? And then also, how did you get into Andrew? How did you come to study with him? And how did your early playing become influenced by him?
Well, in the late 60s, I just got to be friends with Andrew because I grew up, around New York, and I used to go to a lot of gigs, and I was a kind of interested guy who used to make friends with certain musicians, and I became fast friends with Andrew. Rarely understood what the hell he was talking about, for the first few years, but I did become friends, and I did like his music a lot, and then in the 70s. I started working with him, making records and so on and so forth. But Passing Ships is an interesting record because that had a 30-year life in exile. And the reason it did was because it was one of the few times that Rudy made a mistake, where Rudy would usually recorded right to stereo and not multi-track. And then for the one short era, he did record 8-track and stereo at the same time. And the stereo always sounded so good that you didn't need the 8-track. But in this case, half of one channel didn't go to the stereo. For some reason, there was just a breakdown in wiring or something. So the tape sounded like a train wreck. And I sent a copy to Andrew, and he agreed. And it kept popping up over the years. Lenny White would ask me about it, Howard Johnson. And finally, around the year 2000, about that time, Andrew said, we should take another look at that record. So I got CDRs of it, and I said, it's still the same mess, and I sent it to Andrew, and he agreed. But I was listening with headphones on, and I heard echo of a lot of missing instruments. So I ordered the 8-track tapes, and when I put up all the tracks, all the instruments were there, and it sounded great. So it finally came out, but it was 30 years in the making,
I met Andrew through Greg Osby. It was at the same time that Greg Osby was still in Andrew Hill's band. And Greg was a great mentor. I mean, he brought me to the label, but he also started sending, the material that we were working on together to Andrew and said, you should listen to this young piano player. And right at the beginning of my Blue Note career, I was able to study with Andrew Hill for years up until he passed away. And he was also the mentor that kind of like helped me through certain sessions, especially the Black Stars session with Sam Rivers. Like I remember calling Andrew the night before, and he says, well, Sam Rivers is gonna play on this record? And he's like, well, you won't have any control. He said, just ride it, just, because there's nobody who could play like Sam, and it's just gonna be a very different ride. But he also had, the real relationship was not only about music as much as it was about like how to be a person in the business of music and how to think about the future of the music. I mean, he really had a lot of, he may have been like one of those people who can see forward. He told me some things that all came true, that he was able to see about me that I was not able to see. It was very strange. And a lot of them came true after he passed away. So our relationship was like very close, and I felt like he thought of me as like a son for a long time. And so I have a great, love. I mean, I heard that music for the first time when I was in high school because I had read somewhere that they relayed Andrew Hill's music to Monk's music, and I was like, okay, well, let me listen to Andrew Hill. But then I heard how free that rhythm was, and I was like, oh, this is a great ocean. So when I got to New York, they were playing at the Village Vanguard, and I just went every night with my tape recorder and just bootlegged every set, And I bootlegged Lou Donaldson too at the Vanguard. I had to. It was so good. But that was also the way that I could learn, was going to see people play. And Andrew was one of these musicians who was always kind of like messing up the mix over and over again, putting his hands in it and making it blurry.
Who else has a question? Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Favorite Blue Note, probably Cool Strut and Sonny Clark. I guess this is for Michael, a two-part. Were you the first, last, and only voice in all the RVG reissues? Were you like the deciding?
No, not totally. Some of them, you mean choosing the titles?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no. Some that came from Japan, from Hitoshi Namekata, who ran Blue Note in Japan. But I'll tell you one very interesting thing about those. When we first started doing those, I'd get a call on Saturday morning, and it would be Rudy, and he'd say, "Man, I'm listening to this Tina Brooks True Blue. Boy, this guy's a gorgeous tenor player. He's really amazing." And I said, "Rudy, you're acting like you're hearing the music for the first time." And he said, "I am." He said, when you're a recording engineer, enjoying the music and taking it in is not what you're doing. You're about capturing the sound and getting what the artist wants on tape. And it has nothing to do with a listening experience." So a lot of that stuff he discovered and fell in love with while we were doing those RVG reissues.
And where are the, I guess I want to say the lost tapes, because they're not lost, but where are the artists that never got their due on these reissues? The Dizzy Reese's, the people like that, the lesser known.
Yeah, well,
was it ever in the works that they were,
They've come out at various times. And the great thing is that in 1989, there was a guy named Jim Fifield who was the CEO in charge of EMI. And he said, we're going to, not just Blue Note, but every artist that ever recorded for EMI around the world, we're going to wipe out all that bullshit debt that's on the books for these people. And no matter if they had a 2% or a 3% royalty, we're bumping it all up to 10%, and we're paying them from record one from now on. So this was great for us. So I was sending Hank Mobley's father $85,000 checks and stuff. And it was just a wonderful thing. And all these guys, Freddie Red and Dizzy Reese and all, they all got paid a nice chunk of money for whatever sold, because they got rid of that old barbaric practice of charging things against the artist and paying them low royalties.
Now, both Michael and Lou have mentioned Rudy Van Gelder and the fact that he was so instrumental at documenting and capturing the sound. Can you, especially Lou, I want you to talk a little bit about why you think Van Gelder was any different from any other recording engineer.
Well, in the first place, he's the first one to use this Telefunken equipment. I remember way back, had to be in the early 50s. He sent over to Germany. In fact, they didn't even sell it in the United States at that time, and got this equipment. And he got different sound. If you don't believe it, you listen to Alligator Boogaloo, some records like that. Those records are perfect. They had to sell. The sound alone sold the records.
Did you record in both of his studios in Inglewood?
Yeah,
and
of course. I started recording in his house.
Uh-huh.
He had one room. He'd record everything in one room. And he had that equipment in there, and it was beautiful.
Uh-huh. Who else has a question? Yes, sir. Oh, hold on. Let's wait for the microphone. And your favorite Blue Note recording?
You know, you can't pick your favorite child. You love them all because they're all so great. But there's one I'd like to mention. It's by Saint Germain Tourist. I'm curious about Real Gone Jazz, the label, because I see a lot of Blue Note stuff being reissued for a couple of bucks a CD, and I'm wondering if you could comment about that.
Real Gone, is that a UK label?
I don't know if it's
I
European,
think it
but
is. Yeah, I think it's a UK label. You know, unfortunately, in Europe, and they didn't head it off till recently. Anything that was released 50 years or older, it becomes public domain. The artist doesn't get paid, the label doesn't get paid. The only songwriters and publishers still get paid, but that's all. And so a lot of this stuff is now coming out through these labels that are kind of legal bootlegs, you know. It's a shame. I mean, the artist is getting ripped off. The composers are still whole. They're still getting paid. I think as time goes on and we see less and less CDs put out by American record companies, it'll probably be a welcome thing. But it's not something that I like because I don't think there's quality control and there aren't royalties being paid.
I think we have time for maybe one more question here in the front row.
Hi, favorite record probably Out to Lunch, Bobby Hutcherson. Also something.
Eric Dolphy or?
Dolphy, yes, sure. But the album Something Else, normally a Hank Jones album with Miles Davis and Cannonball. Does anybody know the genesis of that? I mean, was it really a Miles Davis session or because of
Cannonball session?
Cannonball was the leader, but if you listen to the session reels, Miles is calling the shots all the way through it. He's kind of acting like it's his date on the actual session reels. But I don't know how it came about. Do you?
Yes, Cannonball's date, and he had Miles. And I often talk to my manager about it because it's a different kind of a date. Art Blakey is playing drums. Sam Jones is playing bass. And on that date, Art Blakey didn't do any of the loud, crazy, you know, aggravating stuff that he did. It messed up the music. Because of one reason, Hank Jones was a very sensitive guy. And if he'd have done anything like that, Hank would have jumped up and quit and wouldn't have played. So I played real subdued, and it's a great record. The best I ever heard. Cannonball and Miles even played good on that record, which is unusual because he usually messed up most of his, you know. But that was a very good date. And it's odd for Blue Note because neither one of them, you know, really made big records at Blue Note. They were another company.
So let me wrap things up by just saying this has been such a great pleasure to hear these stories, reminiscences. And we've been talking about the past a lot, but Blue Note continues. Bruce Lundvall is sort of chairman emeritus. The label is now run by Don Was. And I'm wondering what you all on the panel think about Was and the direction he seems to be taking the label in. Where do you think Blue Note is headed?
I'll take the first shot. I love Don. He's a great producer. He's a great pop bass player, and he loves jazz. The first time I met him was he was producing a friend of mine, Bonnie Raitt, and I went to the session. And when Bonnie introduced me to him, the first thing he said to me was, "What microphone do you use on Woody Shaw?" So he's clearly serious about jazz. I think it remains to be seen where the label is going to go. Some of the records that he has caused into existence, I like. Others, I don't. I like the fact that he's trying to involve himself with serious musicians, whether it's an Aaron Neville or Jason or Glasper. But his imprint is yet to be, I think, heard, seen.
Jason?
Yeah, we're at it seems like the very beginning, you know. But I feel good because he and Bruce Lundvall have the same birth date,
That's right.
and that's nice feeling. He's been very supportive. You know, I always like to. Actually, I don't like to tell this story, but my budget for the first record was the same budget I had for my last record. I haven't got no better, but he continues to kind of, like you said, get a project out there, and yeah, so and that we have the support of somebody like him who's going to go, and he has to really go fight for projects. He has to fight, and it's the same way Bruce had to fight too for projects. And so I feel like the company's in capable hands with him.
And Lou, let's close by my asking.
You don't want to do that because Blue Note has always been to me the greatest jazz record company. I mean, you've had larger companies with, bigger budgets and they could produce, bigger things, but it's more like they said, a family label. Now the recent, you can't ask me about that. I don't even listen to that type of music since the 70s, I figured for me everything stopped around there because I know they just re-signed Wayne Shorter and they got Cassandra Wilson and Joe Lovano and all those people. I don't listen to no stuff like that, that to me that's just, what can I tell you?
What do you listen
It
to?
disturbs me. I listen to the old records. They're much better than the ones they're making now. You got no records on that label can compare to nothing that we made. I just heard the sermon the other day. No record nowhere around there even compares to that. It's a different category altogether. Night at Birdland, different category altogether. Today the younger musicians go to school too much, and it's just like the good book, the good book, which I'm not religious. I'm very far from being that. But good book tells you can profit a lot, but you can gain a lot, but you lose your soul. And that's what's happening to not only Blue Note, the rest of the jazz companies too. They lost their soul.
Well, I'm glad to say this man never lost his soul.
They might still have some souls, but they got holes in them.
Thank you all for coming. Please help me thank our panelists.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.